Imagine debt collectors showing up at your house not with a clipboard, but with a battleship. Imagine defaulting on a loan and having your car blown up by a naval cannon instead of just repossessed. This sounds like fiction, but in 1902, it was the reality for Venezuela. When the country refused to pay its foreign debts, Europe did not send lawyers. They sent the Navy. This forgotten crisis brought the world to the brink of war and fundamentally changed how the United States controls the Western Hemisphere. Inside the global economy breaks down the hidden forces shaping the world economy. The year is 1902, and Venezuela is a nation on fire. It has been torn apart by decades of civil war. The government in Caracas is barely holding on to power. The man in charge is a dictator named Cipriano Castro. He is a charismatic but reckless Caudillo who seized power 3 years earlier. He calls himself the restorer of Venezuela, but the international community has a different name for him. They call him a brute, they call him a thief, and most importantly, they call him a bad debtor. During the civil wars of the 19th century, Venezuela had borrowed heavily from European banks. They borrowed to build railroads that were never finished. They borrowed to buy weapons for armies that no longer existed. And during the chaos of the revolutions, foreign property was destroyed. British merchants had their warehouses looted. German railway engineers were not paid. Italian businessmen had their land seized. By 1902, the bill had come due. The governments of Great Britain, Germany, and Italy demanded repayment. They wanted millions of bolivars in damages and unpaid interest. Cipriano Castro looked at the empty treasury in Caracas and shrugged. He famously said that Venezuela does not argue with creditors because Venezuela does not have any money. He bet that the Europeans were bluffing. He bet that the Atlantic Ocean was too wide and the cost of war was too high for them to actually do anything about it. He was wrong. He failed to understand that the world had changed. We were in the peak era of imperialism. This was the age where the great powers of Europe were carving up Africa and Asia. They were used to using gunboats to force weaker nations to submit, and they were terrified of losing prestige. If a small Caribbean nation could stiff the Kaiser of Germany and the King of England without consequence, what message would that send to the rest of their colonies? So the order was given. In London, Berlin, and Rome, the fleets were mobilized. This was not a diplomatic mission. It was an act of war. In December 1902, a massive joint naval force arrived off the coast of Venezuela. It was one of the most powerful armadas ever seen in the Caribbean. The action started immediately. On December 9th, British and German warships sailed into the harbor of La Guaira. They did not wait for negotiations. They seized the Venezuelan Navy. It wasn't much of a navy, just a few gunboats and converted yachts, but it was the pride of the nation. The Europeans towed the Venezuelan ships out to sea and sank them. They disabled others right in the harbor. Castro was furious. He ordered the arrest of all British and German citizens in Venezuela. He called on the people to rise up and defend the fatherland against the insolent foreigner. Mobs in Caracas attacked British and German houses, but enthusiasm cannot stop a 12-inch naval shell. The Europeans escalated. They established a total blockade of the Venezuelan coast. Nothing went in, nothing came out. This strangled the Venezuelan economy, which relied entirely on coffee and cocoa exports. Then came the violence. When a Venezuelan fort at Puerto Cabello fired a few shots at a British ship, the response was overwhelming. The British and German ships opened fire and bombarded the city. They turned the fort into rubble and terrified the civilian population. For a moment, it looked like Venezuela was about to become a European colony. There were rumors that Germany wanted to seize a port permanently. Maybe they would take Margarita Island and turn it into a Caribbean naval base. Kaiser Wilhelm II was ambitious. He wanted a German empire to rival the British, and he saw South America as a place ripe for conquest. But there was one problem with this plan, a problem that stood 6,000 miles to the north, the United States of America. In the White House sat Theodore Roosevelt. He was a young, energetic president who believed that the United States was destined to be a great power, and he was a devout believer in the Monroe Doctrine. This was a policy from 1823 that stated that the Americas were closed to further European colonization. It said that any attempt by Europe to control the destiny of a Latin American nation would be viewed as a hostile act against the United States. For 80 years, the Monroe Doctrine had been mostly just words. The U.S. did not have the Navy to back it up, but by 1902, the U.S. did have the Navy, and Roosevelt was ready to use it. Roosevelt was in a difficult position. On one hand, he despised Cipriano Castro. He called him an unspeakably villainous little monkey. Roosevelt believed that nations should pay their debts. He did not want the United States to become a shield for corrupt dictators who stole money from European banks. He actually told the Germans privately that if they wanted to spank Venezuela, he would not object. But on the other hand, Roosevelt was terrified of German expansion. He knew that debt collection was often a pretext for conquest. The British had used debt as an excuse to take over Egypt just 20 years earlier. If Germany seized a port in Venezuela, they would have a foothold in the Caribbean right next to the proposed Panama Canal that Roosevelt wanted to build. That was a strategic nightmare for the United States. So Roosevelt played a dangerous game of poker. He ordered the U.S. Navy under Admiral George Dewey to mobilize in Puerto Rico. He told them to be ready to sail for Venezuela at a moment's notice. It was a subtle threat, but the message was clear. You can collect your money, but you cannot take the land. The crisis dragged on for months. The blockade was starving Venezuela. The bombardment of the coast was making the U.S. public angry. Americans saw the European powers bullying a small neighbor, and they demanded action. The press painted the Germans as bloodthirsty aggressors. Finally, the pressure became too much. The British were getting nervous about angering the Americans. The Germans realized that a war with the U.S. over Venezuelan debt was not worth it. They agreed to arbitration. They agreed to lift the blockade if Venezuela promised to set aside 30% of its customs revenue to pay the debts. The guns fell silent. The ships sailed home. On the surface, it looked like a return to the status quo. But everything had changed. The Venezuela Crisis of 1902 was the catalyst for a fundamental shift in how the global economy worked. President Roosevelt realized that this situation could not happen again. He could not allow European navies to blockade Latin American countries every time a dictator defaulted on a bond. It was too dangerous. It invited war into the American hemisphere. But he also knew that Latin American countries were unstable and prone to default. If the U.S. forbade the Europeans from collecting their debts, then the Europeans would stop lending money. The flow of capital to the region would dry up. Or worse, the Europeans would ignore the U.S. and invade anyway. So Roosevelt came up with a new solution. A solution that would turn the United States into the policeman of the hemisphere. In 1904, he announced what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It was a stunning declaration of power. Roosevelt said that if a Latin American nation engaged in chronic wrongdoing or impotence which resulted in a failure to pay its obligations, the United States would be forced to exercise an international police power. Translated from diplomatic language, this meant we will not let Europe invade you to collect debt. Instead, we will invade you to collect the debt for them. The United States effectively appointed itself the bankruptcy judge and the debt collector for the entire Western Hemisphere. If a country like Venezuela or the Dominican Republic could not pay its bills, the U.S. Marines would land. They would seize the customs house, which was usually the only source of government revenue. U.S. officials would sit at the desks and collect the taxes. They would take 50% to pay back the European bankers and give the other 50% to the local government to run the country. This was a massive expansion of American power. Before 1902, the U.S. just wanted Europe to stay out. After 1902, the U.S. was actively managing the economies of its neighbors. It turned the Caribbean into an American lake. The impact of this decision was felt for the next 100 years. It led directly to the U.S. occupation of the Dominican Republic in 1905. It led to the occupation of Nicaragua in 1912 and Haiti in 1915. In each case, the pattern was the same. The country owed money. The political situation was unstable. The Marines landed to restore order and ensure the bankers got paid. This created a legacy of resentment that still exists today. For the Latin American nations, it felt like swapping one master for another. They were no longer colonies of Spain, but they were financial dependencies of Wall Street and Washington. Their sovereignty ended where their debt began. But from the perspective of the global economy, it was a stabilizing force. It reassured investors in London and New York that their capital was safe. It allowed money to flow into the region, to build railroads and sugar plantations and oil wells. It integrated Latin America into the global capitalist system, but at the barrel of a gun. The Venezuela crisis also marked the moment when the United States truly became a world power. Before 1902, the U.S. was a regional player. After 1902, it was the hegemon of the Western Hemisphere. The European powers accepted this new reality. Britain implicitly agreed to withdraw its navy from the Caribbean and let the Americans handle security. It was the passing of the torch. Cipriano Castro, the man who started it all, did not last long. He continued to defy the international community until he fell ill in 1908 and went to Europe for surgery. While he was gone, his vice president Juan Vicente Gómez seized power with the support of the U.S. Navy. Gómez was a brutal dictator, but he was a dictator who paid his bills. He invited foreign oil companies into Venezuela and used the revenue to pay off the entire national debt. He was exactly the kind of strongman that the Roosevelt Corollary was designed to support. The story of the 1902 blockade is a reminder that debt is never just about money. It is about power. When a nation borrows from another nation, it is selling a piece of its sovereignty. And when that nation cannot pay, the consequences are rarely limited to a credit score. In the modern world, we use the IMF and the World Bank to manage these crises. We send economists in suits instead of admirals in battleships. But the underlying dynamic remains the same. The creditor dictates the terms to the debtor. Today, Venezuela is once again in a debt crisis. It owes billions to China and Russia and private bondholders. Its economy is shattered. Its oil industry is crumbling. And once again, great powers are circling, trying to exert influence through loans and sanctions. The gunboats are gone, but the game is the same. The Roosevelt Corollary taught us that a vacuum of power will always be filled. If a country cannot govern itself effectively, someone else will step in to do it. In 1902, it was the British and Germans. Then it became the Americans. Tomorrow, it might be the Chinese. The lesson for us as investors and students of history is to watch the debt. Sovereign debt is the fault line where geopolitics and economics meet. When the debt becomes unpayable, the tanks or the sanctions or the regime change operations are never far behind. The gunboat bankruptcy was a small event in a small country, but it cast a long shadow. It drew the lines on the map that we still live with today. It established the rules of the American empire. And it proved that in the global economy, there is no such thing as a sovereign default without political consequences. The battleships have rusted away. Teddy Roosevelt is a statue, but the question remains, who owns a nation when that nation is broke? In 1902, the answer was delivered in high explosive shells. Today, the answer is hidden in complex restructuring agreements and oil for loan deals. But the reality is the same. He who pays the piper calls the tune, and he who cannot pay the piper faces the music. So the next time you see a headline about a sovereign debt crisis in Argentina or Greece or Sri Lanka, remember the Venezuelan coast in 1902. Remember the smoke rising from Puerto Cabello. Remember that the polite machinery of modern finance was built to prevent us from returning to a world where bankers collected their interest with cannon fire. But the threat of force is always there, just beneath the surface, hidden in the fine print of the global order. This is the hidden history of how the US dollar and the US Navy became the ultimate guarantors of debt in the Western Hemisphere. It started with a bluff by a dictator and ended with a new doctrine of imperial power. Inside the global economy, we'll continue to uncover these forgotten turning points. Because to understand where the money is going, you have to understand where the power came from. And usually it came from the barrel of a gun.